to have some bloated politician who clearly knows very little about the natural world telling you what to do, and it's all got to be then wedged into 5 years, and then the next bloated politician comes in with a different coloured rosette and say, no, we're going to do an about turn and do something completely different, isn't just damaging to the economics of the countryside and farming and for conservation. It's disastrous for wildlife.
On British thought leaders, Richard Negus talks about a growing gulf between Westminster and the countryside.
We can see that the inheritance tax on farmland policy is not going to generate them the income that they originally proposed. So therefore, why would they do it? Well, it's a form of control and coercion. You will use your land the way that we want to.
Richard says policies such as rewilding show little knowledge of how the countryside actually works.
Rewilding, to my mind, is largely a rich man's plaything, or it's a lazy man's answer. I can see why politicians like rewilding, because shutting the gate and running away seems very cost effective. Well, I think that takes away our responsibility to right wrongs that we have done.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Richard Negus, who is a conservationist, author and hedge layer. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I know you present a podcast on rural issues. I wanted to start talking about farming and food. We're losing farms at an alarming rate, especially the smaller ones. We're becoming less self-sufficient when it comes to food. Why is this happening? What's driving it?
I think largely it's because governments forget the importance of having some sort of security when it comes to our food. It's a repeating pattern. We had that immediately after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. We could import food again because Napoleon was no longer trying to sink our ships, right. And we stopped farming as successfully as we had done. And then when the First World War reared its head, we suddenly realised that possibly we needed to be more self-sufficient again. And then we forgot those lessons, and then the Second World War was the same thing, and now we're just on that downward petering spiral that we think that we can import food easier than we can grow it ourselves. I think one of the important things is that when we used to import food, vast swathes of it used to come from our empire. We lost an empire, so now we are importing food from countries where we don't see a financial benefit back to the national exchequer in some way.
And the government consulted on plans to reduce farmland by 10% for net zero and for wildlife. Do you think to some degree farmers see a bit of a battle between food security and these green policies?
Well, first, what is a green policy? I think the net zero idea is a peculiar one, and it doesn't actually dovetail with nature very well at all. I think the farmers comprehended the fact that after we'd left the European Union, that there was no longer going to be the cushion of the common agricultural policy, that you were going to get paid just because you owned productive farmland. I think they embraced that, and I think they embraced the previous administration's ELMS policy, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, quite readily. I think they saw that it wasn't just that they were going to give more land over to wildlife habitats, to cleaner water, cleaner air, etc. I think they saw that there was great investment in making their farms more sustainable going forward. Putting in infrastructure that meant that they could farm more efficiently and move away from a yield being everything that you concentrated your efforts on, and instead on your gross margin. I think they embraced that. I think the sudden rush to use farmland for energy sources which are supposedly green, solar, wind, etc. I think that's something that they haven't embraced so readily because it loses their flexibility. We go back to your earlier question about food security. If you're going to put solar panels down for 30 years, you have lost your flexibility to be able to grow more wheat, should we need to. Whereas if you put fields down to have more wildflower, to have wild bird cover, wild bird seed, those sorts of things. They can be reversed if the need arises. If all of a sudden the next version of the U-boat suddenly appears out in the Atlantic, we can revert that back quite quickly to food production. If it's a sea of solar panels, no.
We saw protests here in London. The tractors were going around. And many farmers are operating at a loss or minimal profit. How do you see the relationship between rural folk and Westminster at the moment?
I think it's a lot worse than it was. I don't think that the body politic, 80% of the population live in urban areas, 72% of the land mass is farmland. Politicians realise that a very small proportion of the population have great control over huge swathes of the land, and they as politicians don't get the control over that land. And I think probably the latest policies that we're seeing from this Labour government are very much trying to redress that, to swing the balance back in favour of Westminster having greater control over the land. And, you know, I walked here past a statue of Lloyd George. He was the first person to bring in inheritance tax, as we understand it. And that broke up the old estates. It broke up the aristocracy's control of the land. The administration we currently soldier on under Sir Keir Starmer is just another version of what Lloyd George tried to do. He's trying to break the control over smaller farmers, family farmers, people who are cash poor but land rich. And, you know, the average return on investment for the average farmer in this country is 1.2%.
Really?
It's nothing. Oh. I gave a talk not so long ago to some people who were builders. They were looking at how they might build more with nature rather than against it. And when I gave them that figure, they all just laughed and they said, you know, no one would start digging a footing if the return on investment was so tiny. So it clearly, this government may be slightly economically illiterate, but they're not completely stupid. So therefore you would ask yourself, why are you trying to tax those who can least afford it, being the farmer? Well, it's clearly not a revenue generator. We can see that the inheritance tax on farmland policy is not going to generate them the income that they originally proposed. So therefore, why would they do it? Well, it's a form of control and coercion. You will use your land the way that we want to. It will become solar panels. You will have electricity pylons over there because the only option we're giving you is to accept that cash bung, if you like, to have your farm turn into a solar farm.
The understanding of that being that they will import food because they're reducing the ways we can produce it.
Yes, totally. And that's where the whole oxymoronic nature comes in, because ostensibly we're told that if we do put solar and wind and turbines that are out at sea are then going to have their pylons coming through farmland, that this will somehow be greener. Well, that's utterly oxymoronic, because we will have to import more food as a result. And it's not just the immediate dirtier methods of transporting that food, but we have some of the highest animal welfare regulations in the world here. We have more bans on chemicals that you can use as pesticides or herbicides here than anywhere else in the world. So we're importing food from places that are environmentally dirtier than us. So really it's kicking the can down the road, but it's also just sticking your fingers in your ears. And it seems to be some vainglorious attempt is that we keep getting told by the Energy Minister, Ed Miliband, that we are leading. Well, I should imagine most other countries are quite delighted that we lead in this thing, because we're taking all the hits and gaining none of the benefits.
You mentioned about 80% of people not being rural folk. Do you think a lot of those people understand the connection between farming and food and where their food actually comes from?
No, I think very few do. And that isn't wanton ignorance on their part. I think it's, I mean, you've only got to look at the popularity of Clarkson's Farm on television. And it's not just because Jeremy Clarkson is a near-the-knuckle, humorous, excellent and very funny journalist. It's because they are learning things within that television programme which they didn't know. I often refer back in talks that I give to the year 1851. 1851 is a pivotal year in Britain because 1851 was the first year that more people registered on the census as living in urban areas than in rural areas.
Oh, right.
So from 1851 onwards, you had generation after generation who became increasingly removed from the land. And so therefore, you've only got to look at the notion that this government has that they want to build on allotments is that, you know, that they're taking away those last vestiges of connection with where your food comes from and how it grows. I think as well the media has a lot to blame because it's not just the land and where your food comes from, but it's all the other things that call the countryside home. Our wildlife is almost overlooked in preference of a BBC documentary where they'll go to every corner of the world filming polar bears or penguins or pandas, zebras. They so very rarely ever look at the wildlife we have here and its fascinating behaviour and characteristics and uniqueness. That almost seems to be forgotten about in favour of some sort of perceived beauty that exotic species are somehow better. And so yeah, we have a great disconnect with the land. It's historical, but also I suppose it's understandable. Is that we've got a funny, very interesting thing. You talked about the farmers' protest. I was on that and came here. The perception that the government was trying to put across was this is a bunch of rich farmers who were coming along in their tractors and whinging. Pay your taxes was the mantra from them. I went to a meeting in Westminster Hall with an MP from Norfolk afterwards, and on my way there I bumped into two paramedics in their ambulance, and it's quite amusing because they wanted to chat to me for so long the traffic lights kept changing, but I guess you can sit in front of a traffic light and do your light when you're in an ambulance. But they could tell by the way that I was dressed, and they said, "You on this farmers' protest?" Because we all wear a uniform really, don't we? And it was quite interesting, and they said, "What's it all about?" And I said, one of the claims is that unless farming pays its way, that the NHS will suffer. And they were really quite irate. They said, you know, that makes no sense at all. They were saying, you know, being healthy, eating good food, you lot producing it here well, he said, is the thing that keeps people at the back of my ambulance. So these two paramedics got it, and I think that A, they were irate because they didn't like the equation is we'll take from the farmer to give to the NHS. I think they didn't, not in my name. Yeah. But secondly, they realised the importance of healthy food grown well with a provenance to it. And it seems that that doesn't filter from the paramedic on the street to the health minister. And the health minister then doesn't talk to the DEFRA Secretary of State, and the DEFRA Secretary of State doesn't then talk to the Treasury. There's so much disconnect that they don't see that one of our fundamentals isn't just food, it's food that's grown here, grown well with provenance.
I think this gulf in understanding isn't just about food. In looking after the countryside can be quite a raw or brutal task. There's things such as predator control, shooting. But people in the urban areas have this kind of Disneyfied version of what countryside life should be like, maybe even see those things as barbaric. And what impact do you think that difference has?
I think it has a huge impact because I suppose if your only connection with wildlife, say if you live in central London and your walk that you take is into one of the parks here, you will see some ornamental ducks. and you will see some grey squirrels. You'll probably, when you put your bin out, you'll see an urban fox. You might have some pigeons sat around. But really and truthfully, most of the wildlife that you see are species that are either ornamental and beautiful, or otherwise they are what we would call species that we might control, either for crop protection, in the case of the pigeon, or for predator control, in the case of the grey squirrel and the fox. And I suppose if your only connection with wildlife are those species, and you suddenly say, well, there's this bloke Richard Negus and he kills them because he says it's good for nature, you're thinking, well, I don't get it, because their version of nature is just the things that they see around them. And I suppose because of that disconnect with farming and food and the disconnect with the countryside, is that the narrative that predator control is essential. The three-legged stool of conservation is providing significant and correct habitat, significant correct food sources, and protection from predators.
Right.
That was the Aldo Leopold three-legged stool of conservation. That third-legged stool, third leg of the stool, has been overlooked largely through squeamishness, and secondly just back to the lack of understanding that we are the last apex predator left standing.
I mean, what can we do about this? I think Clarkson's farm, as you said, has definitely had some effect. You see some of the decisions he has to make and stuff. What other ways can we influence this?
I think we, in the rural communities, farming communities, the practical conservation communities, we've been appalling in explaining what we do. Now, it used to be very easy that we would blame it on the BBC. We'd blame it that Chris Packham has got a one agenda thing. That's just lazy. We have access now to so much social media, digital channels, that we can go and say, explain what we do. And I think that too often people just go and show the end result. They show the dead fox and they say that's better for the rare grey partridge or curlew, or they will go and show the bag of spuds or the loaf of bread or the chicken roasted. They forget to show the from start to finish, the whole process, the reason why. And one of the reasons why I wrote my book, one of the reasons why we have our Country Slide podcast, is not to preach, but to explain to people how we go about our work and why. And rather than preaching, saying you don't understand our country ways, well, okay, let's say, no, they don't understand our country ways, so let's do something about it. So rather than shaking the fist, there's a rather tired narrative that I hear from some people who want demand, more land access, that people need nature, and that the more you understand nature, the more you'll care about it. I buy that argument, but we've also got to ask the question, does nature need more people? And I'll be perfectly honest, no. Nature would rather be like Marlene Dietrich, left alone. But we are the last apex predator standing, and a hedge won't lay itself, a wood won't thin itself. So therefore we do need people on the land doing jobs like I do, as well as the farmers, to make sure that that farmland is a place for nature as well as a place for growing food. And so I think I can understand why some people get a bit irate that they see their taxes going on paying for people like me to go and do the work that I do, and they don't actually necessarily always get to see the benefits. They don't get to see the flocks of yellowhammers, the flocks of linnets, the wild grey partridge nesting in the lee of one of my hedges. They don't get to see the lapwings on a lapwing plot, or the curlews calling out on an improved wetland. They don't get to see that, which is a shame. So therefore perhaps another way that we could show what we do is, again, use digital channels to show British wildlife in its habitat within a working countryside which is predominantly farming.
Yeah. A lot of the choices that farmers make and people that work in the countryside are not just about producing food, but also about conservation as well. Can you give us some examples of that?
Okay, let's use the thing that I'm most closely associated with, which is the hedge laying. So a hedge is a man-made construct in its own right. Some are ancient, some have only been planted very recently. But the hedgerow is an agricultural device first and foremost. It was originally used for keeping livestock in one field and not straying into where you didn't want it to be. Or it was there for soil erosion, preventing soil erosion. It was for retaining moisture through capillary action. It divided your farm from your neighbours, so many agricultural purposes. But we learned that the act of hedge laying, which used to just improve the hedge make it a better barrier, made it a better habitat for wildlife.
Right.
The government were persuaded that this was a good action, that it did actually improve habitats and it improved the wildlife's lot and made farming better. So therefore it provides a grant. And that grant, either under countryside stewardship or the environmental land management schemes, SFI, we use a lot of anachronisms, I'm afraid, in conservation, which is the sustainable farming incentive, that paid for farmers to manage their hedgerows better.
Right.
The farmer then is working extremely hard trying to grow food, so he then gets contractors such as myself to come in and lay his hedges. And alongside that laid hedge may well be a strip of pollen and nectar mix, what you and I probably more think of as wildflower. And so therefore you've got pollinators, but you've not only got pollinators, you've also got predatory insects who predate on the aphids that eat crops. So it's good for the farmer because not only has he got more pollinators, so therefore if he's growing beans, for example, you're more likely to have a more prolific crop. But you've also got, free of charge, these little tiny voracious predators that are going out there and eating the aphids that are eating your beans,
Right.
but you don't have to go and spray them with a chemical. So you don't have to spray them with a chemical as much because you've got these aphids doing the job for you, so you are saving costs on that. So the whole idea of elms, of farming with nature, was actually very sustainable because it was good for nature. We all know that there is some species decline. And we were seeing just the green shoots of nature recovery because of these long-standing countryside stewardship, then the new post-Brexit elms project. We could see that. You've only got to go and drive your car and your windscreen is once again covered in insects. Yeah? So it's an obvious change. But this government has turned that off like a tap. Now that's got two problems, is that, yeah, okay, for me, am I going to get paid to lay hedges anymore? Well, less so, because the farmer can't afford to just to pay me out of his own pocket. He doesn't find a couple of million down the back of the tractor seed. But secondly, it's a huge issue because wildlife and conservation management and farm planning is always far longer than the simple 5-year terms that government is imposed upon us. I do hedgerow management plans to look how we will rotationally manage hedgerows, and they work on a 20-year cycle because that's more or less the pace that a hedge works at. If you're planting woods, you're working on a century cycle. To have some bloated politician who clearly knows very little about the natural world telling you what to do, and it's all got to be then wedged into 5 years, and then the next bloated politician comes in with a different coloured rosette and say, no, we're going to do an about turn and do something completely different, isn't just damaging to the economics of the countryside and farming and for conservation. It's disastrous for wildlife because wildlife is not so flexible. It can't dance to the tune of the 5-year term. So I'm afraid that it's very easy for us to come to London and shake our fist at monetary policy. It's very easy for us to think this is hugely unfair, the inheritance tax and all the other swathes of taxes that were lumped on those of us who work in the countryside. But the voiceless are the wildlife who will suffer because they are on the kickback. They obviously can't vote, they can't talk, and we're suddenly going to see huge declines once again in species, courtesy of government policy, this government's policy in particular.
Looking at the contrast between government policy and what people in the countryside want to do, there was a proposal to ban winter burning. And And you got the gamekeepers there saying if you do that, the uplands will become this massive tinderbox. I think the Countryside Alliance said something along the lines of this plan shows a lack of knowledge and understanding. And is this kind of par for the course that the government proposals and people in the countryside have such massive differences in views on how to do things?
Wholly. I mean, I'm no expert on the uplands, but I mean, I do know that managed muirburn is part and parcel of a land management strategy that has been used in the uplands for centuries, and it works. If I look what I would understand in my lowland setting, we are given wonderful targets of we're going to plant 45,000 miles more hedgerows in this country because that sounds superb. We're going to plant, I mean, the 2017 general election was hilarious. If I read all the manifestos, and particularly when it came to farming and the environment, and the counterclaim and claim and counterclaim again of all the different parties saying how many trees they would plant on their watch if voted in was ridiculous. I mean, we're talking, in the case of the Liberal Democrats, billions of trees.
Billions.
Billions of trees. Now, firstly, where are we going to grow crops if you're going to go and sway this and return England to the Great Forest? That clearly is a bonkers thing. But just the minutiae of, well, if you plant 1 metre of new hedgerow, that is 6 hedge plants that you have to put in, that have to be grown. You then times that, 45,000 miles is 73,000 kilometres? Well, you times 73,000 by 6, that's a lot of hedge plants. We don't grow anywhere near that much in this country, so we're going to have to import them. Because we've got a deer overabundance in the south of England, a serious deer overabundance, particularly of non-native species like muntjac and fallow deer, that they eat all those hedgerows that we then put in because no one's bought in any culling programme, so we have to wrap them in plastic, single-use plastic, I hasten to add. We don't put hazel canes to hold these young plants up because we've stopped rotationally managing our woodlands, so we have to import bamboo from China.
Right.
So you've got a system that the government has put in place which looks and sounds wonderful on paper, but much like the muir burning, if you stop muir burning, yes, you might get possibly some carbon benefit, possibly, but you will have worse moors. You can say, well, we're going to go and plant more trees, more woods, more hedges, which sounds wonderful on paper, but we don't look after what we already have well. And the implications of planting more, putting more in, without the infrastructure of what you're going to plant, or indeed mugs like me who actually go and plant them and then look after these trees and hedgerows in the future, is a fool's errand. So I think that muirburn is a perfect example of how a government thinks it will get a quick fix in a like, especially a government that isn't blind and it knows it is disliked at the moment. So let's stop doing that, because they'll probably go and say, yeah, but that's going to go and stuff all those toffs who like driven grouse shooting. And once again, it's our countryside lies bleeding at the usually the whim, and usually a silly whim, of a politician who has no idea of how the countryside or its inhabitants work.
We've seen also with rewilding, it's become quite fashionable now, this idea that, oh, forget about farming, we just let it return to nature, it'll be good for the environment. You know, how sensible or realistic is it, and what would the consequence be if we did that on a large scale?
The concept of having wilder places, even within the confines of a farm, an arable field, if you have wilder margins with bigger, thicker, healthier hedgerows, more wildflower around those edges, that's sensible. But the actual concept of rewilding, as it is known, where you shut the gate, walk away, and nature will apparently heal itself, I think is a lazy and largely foolish idea. And now, obviously, the food security damage that rewilding vast swathes does. If it's viable farmland, why are we trying to revert to something, you know, that used to exist when we had a population of 2.5 million in this country? You know, back 1510, I think there's 2.5 million people lived here. Well, we've now got a population of 70, 80, I don't know how many million, tens, millions and billions we've got here. But rewilding those to that point in time is just farcical. But secondly, I think largely Britain, but certainly England, has forgotten what wild even was. We have managed the landscapes here for our own ends largely for such a long time that to rewild places is either impossible or actually positively damaging, because the rewilder's mantra is that somehow we human beings aren't part of nature. If we remove us out of it, then everything will be fine. Well, that's to deny our history, our heritage, and our evolution. We have been managing land since we know the earliest hedge in Europe is in the UK, in England, near Peterborough, Flag Fen. That's where it is. That's 2500 BC. That
Really?
was dated to.
Wow.
So at 2500 BC, we were already planting hedges and managing them, digging ditches to drain land. It shows you how long we have been impacting nature. Rewilding, to my mind, is largely a rich man's plaything, or it's a lazy man's answer. I can see why politicians like rewilding, because shutting the gate and running away seems very cost effective. Well, I think that takes away our responsibility to right wrongs that we have done. And there's no doubt about it. Chemical farming was a short-term boom, and now we are experiencing the bust. I think our greed of wanting that thing right now, that greed that we only want to eat the prime cuts, we aren't prepared to go and eat the scrag end, that thing that we want to have ultra-processed foods, is our greed as human beings. Rewilding is turning the dial up to 11, and that usually just provides feedback and a ghastly noise. What I propose and what I do and what my colleagues do and the farmers I work with is just dialing our intensity back slightly. Let's manage, we humans manage the land that isn't productive or is dirtier to farm, those little corners and margins where we don't need to grow wheat right up to the hedge. It never grows there. So let's manage that place for wildlife better, not just shut the gate and run away. I can see why people like the idea of rewilding, but it always amuses me. Look at the greatest exponents of rewilding. They're all very wealthy individuals who largely made their money not with farming. They made their living elsewhere, and they think, oh, this is wonderful.
If you do just leave the land, are you more likely to have a kind of monoculture, whereas you're managing the land, you can get various different species and settings?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Which is sorry to be an evasive answer. We certainly know that in the short term you will get, let's use in a lowland setting, if you were to turn my bit of Suffolk, which is good strong clay soil, you walk away from it, you get lots and lots of broadleaf weeds, docks, thistles, nettles, etc. And they drown out most of the wildflower that would have been underneath there, that should have been there, probably when it was sort of marginal heathland, I would imagine. In time, you probably will get a return of some sort of natural that it used to be, although what point of that in history that natural is going to be, we don't know. What we do know is that in that period of change, you get a monoculture.
Right.
And you will usually get an overabundance of generalist predators. So you would have all the corvid species, the badgers, the foxes, rats. They would have an absolute field day because there's no one controlling them, so therefore they would go more, and you would get the ground nesting and more endangered species would fall off a perch, if you pardon the pun. And certainly for the flora, you're going to get a lot of that die off. Now, the rewilders, or the more scientific rewilders, claim, well, so give it time, give it time. But nature actually at the moment doesn't really have time. You know, we know that there was such species decline that to say, oh, well, in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time, we'll see wonderful results. If you're dying now, you don't really have the luxury of saying, well, it'll be all right in 40 years' time. So I think there's a lot riding on whether rewilding is a viable option, on this should do, this could do, this maybe will do that. Well, our plots say this, our studies say that this will happen. I'm a realist and a practical conservationist. I'm on the ground and I know I can go back. I looked only yesterday at some hedges that I laid last winter, and I looked at them today and I can watch them bursting out. They're better than they were before, and I can see increased bird numbers. So therefore I can say immediately what I do has very swift results, and I can see it and categorically say that works. It's not could, should, maybe. My modelling suggests that. And I think that we owe it to ourselves to manage land. We aren't the bad guys in this. We've done some daft things, we've done some greedy things, but we're not the bad guys. And this mystical Gaia is not going to save wildlife. It's idiots with calluses on their hands that will.
I wanted to also just go into hedgerows a bit with you. Your book, Words from the Hedges Out. We lost 118,000 miles, I think it was, since 1950 of hedgerow. You know, what happened? Can you give us a brief history lesson, and why is it important?
Brief history then. Well, from that point is that after the end of the war, the Attlee government saw that we were desiccated and hungry, and they wanted to get us off food rationing as swiftly as they could.
Right.
And so therefore some scientists got together with the Ministry of Food, as it was then, and they looked at how they might manage to achieve maximum yield from farmland. And so therefore in the most productive fields they were not only put over to arable production, and so in the southeast and the East Anglia it was largely arable production because the soil suited that, and then they'll say, well, the West Country is better at livestock, so we'll shift that over there. So the mixed farm ended. So therefore we no longer even needed hedges as livestock proofing in East Anglia so much. So therefore they were slightly, well, we don't need them. And then another scientist said, well, if we actually grub the hedge out, you know, we would gain this much more per field, and they added that all up together. That's going to make this many more hectares, so therefore the hedge was superfluous. We'll grub them all out. And they were true, absolutely right. We came off, I think, wheat flour rationing by 1947. Bread was off the ration by 1948. It worked. But then we started to realise that losing all these hedges was actually probably not so good, because we had huge soil erosion, we had lowering fertility, we had to use more chemicals to put nutrients back in the soil, and so hey presto, we've planted them all back up again. But just to say we have lost this many hedgerows since that point is to miss the vital point that the hedge is an agricultural tool. So if you think, we had the Enclosures Acts, you know, starting in actually nearly in the 1500s in some cases, and that was the first time we really started putting hedgerows in. Where you're in Leicestershire, you can still see the ridge and furrow. That is the marks of open field cropping. There were no hedges back in those days because they didn't really need them. The only hedges you probably would have seen were the things, the hedgerows that separated the hundreds or parish boundaries and that sort of thing. Vast, great open fields. When we put hedgerows in for the Enclosure Acts, when we started becoming greater wool producers, we put more hedges in because that was a handy thing. But we grubbed them out again if we no longer needed them. You know, they were an agricultural device. So the hedgerow, and you can see it in maps, you can see it in paintings, in sporting art in particular. You'll see periods where there are hedgerows everywhere, and some periods only 30, 40 years later where you barely see a hedge on the same viewpoint because there was no agricultural necessity for them. So therefore, the hedge has always been something that does fluctuate back and forth, and it's only really, I would say, since about the 1980s that we've realised the biodiversity benefit of the hedgerow. So therefore my predecessors as hedge layers were doing it to improve the agricultural benefits of the hedgerow. Today, we are laying hedges and managing them in the way that our forefathers used to do because it improves the biodiversity benefit of the hedge. And the British farmer has increasingly, up until the 4th of July last year, has, when the new government came in, had more and more embraced the fact that not only were they food producers, but they are the environmental conscience of Britain. And the hedgerow was part of that. And I can see with the farmers who I work for that they are very proud of a good hedge. And this time they're not proud of it because it stops their sheep or their cattle from straying. It's because they know it plays host to yellowhammers and linnets. It's just a change of mindset of the farmer, which they have embraced. Sadly, it doesn't seem that the politician is quite so ready to embrace that.
It's almost kind of the opposite of rewilding. The hedgerow is a kind of man-made structure and you're planning it and you're maintaining it. Can you just talk a bit more about what it means to you and why you do it?
You're quite right. The hedgerow is the antithesis to rewilding. It is unashamedly a better thing for wildlife to have more hedgerows than fewer. That is without shadow of a doubt. But a hedgerow only stays as a hedgerow if you manage it. So what do they mean to me? Well, I suppose it's a lot of the time, if you plant a new wood, and I do plant a lot of woods as well, I probably won't see those woods in maturity. I'll see them have grown. But with a hedgerow, I can plant a hedge, and in our good, strong Suffolk clay soil, 6 to 7 years, it's a meaningful line of lollipops. It'll have those plastic guards I was talking about, have the canes in, great big bushy top. When I lay that hedge, and by hedge laying, that is that I'll remove the guard, I'll remove the cane, and then I'll use a bill hook or a chainsaw to cut about 7/8 of the way through that hedge, down at the bottom, right near the base, and bend it over, cut that little bit of heel off so it's still living, and then stake that in place. The following spring, that'll flush up from the base and all the way along that lateral length, and rather than having growth that goes like that, you've got growth that's meshed together. And I can see in 1 year that my action has done wonders for wildlife. I can see more bird life, I can see more growth, I can see that underneath that hedgerow it's no longer a line of lollipops, it's as thick at the base as it is at the top. And then over the following years, as you just trim that hedge and it grows thicker and tighter, I can see the number of bird life increase, the number of mammals increase, and I suddenly get a farmer will say, do you know what? Great news, got dormice now in my hedges because an ecologist has told them they've got that. And a naturalist will tell me, well, there's more linnets nesting in that hedgerow there. And the farmer will tell me, do you know what, I've just had a payment from my local water authority because my water that's draining off from my fields is now lower in nitrates. Well, that's because the roots of that hedge have become energised by my activities. So I get a personal buzz because I know that I am actually doing an act which I see the fruits of very quickly. I'm a passionate naturalist. I love the countryside and I love wildlife, so therefore I can actually see that my job is doing something. I get on well with my customers. I like farmers. I think they're a pretty honest old bunch, really. And I know that this makes their lives a bit better, both financially and, they are countrymen at heart. And the final thing I like is it does pay my bills. I can have a bill hook and a chainsaw and a very small business that I run in partnership with my business partner, Richard. He's called Richard too. And we can make a difference and it pays our mortgage. And it's something that I so wish that there were more people doing what I do, because there's space for us. There's plenty of vacancies out there. The challenge is we haven't got enough training, we haven't got enough people learning these skills. I'm almost precluded from taking an apprentice on, and I think that we perhaps need to look at our human inputs once again. We could do with more hedge planters, hedge layers, tree planters, arborists, people who are working on the land to do all this thing than we probably could do with ecologists. And I think that's one of the subjects of my book. Where's the next generation of me going to come from? I'm in my mid to late 50s now, and I ain't going to be doing this job forever. So where's the next me come from?
Richard Negus, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.